Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian. In the early 90s, Sierra Online had a quote-unquote fantastic idea. Since computer technology had advanced exponentially in just half a decade, their older catalog from the mid to late 80s was already starting to look a bit dated. So someone, reportedly Ken Williams himself, had the brilliant idea of updating the first games in their now classic series. That would be Police Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, and of course, Space Quest with their latest tech. You'll notice I didn't mention King's Quest in that little roundup, and that's not because I'm in my little "oh, I hate King's Quest" mood. They did do a remake of King's Quest 1 as well, but it wasn't a VGA remake, so just this once, King's Quest is off the hook. Anyway, the idea was to remake the first games in each respective series using the new bells and whistles of the early 90s. Hand-painted 256 color VGA backgrounds, rotoscoped animation, music and digital sound effects courtesy of the now standard sound cards like the Creative Sound Blaster, and of course a point-and-click interface to replace the outdated text parser. And on paper, the idea was actually sound. I mean, the games had already been designed, and most of the text and dialogue could just be copied and pasted from the original games, so this should have been an easy gig, right? Well, turns out it's not quite as simple as that. Slapping a new coat of paint on an existing game sounds like it would be a breeze, but in reality it was anything but. The games all had to be rebuilt from scratch because the remakes ran on Sierra's new SCI engine, whereas the originals were in the older AGI, and the programmers couldn't just port game logic over from one engine to another. But an even worse time sink was the graphics. The artists at Sierra couldn't just upscale the graphics from the originals because those games used vector graphics instead of bitmaps. I guess they could have just painted over the originals, but that wouldn't really have been the showstopper they were hoping for, so they decided to draw brand new graphics for the backgrounds. And similarly, the animated sprites of the games had to be redrawn because now they had a lot more muscle in the animation department, and they were of course keen to show that off. This also meant, unfortunately, that actually making these remakes took quite a lot longer than the higher-ups at Sierra had planned for, and the end results ended up being, somewhat wonky. And in my opinion, no game suffered more from this harebrained execution than the remake of Space Quest 1: The Sarin Encounter. Now, I'm going to refer to this game as Space Quest 1 Remake rather than its colloquial name Space Quest 1 VGA, because, as we all know by now, there was also a separate 16-color EGA version of this game, so Space Quest 1 VGA is kind of a misnomer, but that's not really important in terms of this video. First of all, the remake's very existence is a massive sore spot for the creators of the original, the venerable Two Guys from Andromeda. The remake of Space Quest 1 was developed concurrently with Space Quest 4, which meant that the Two Guys from Andromeda were occupied elsewhere and had little to no say in the development of the remake. In fact, the story goes, rather infamously, that they had no idea the remake was even in development until they got called into Ken Williams' office and were shown a nearly complete build of the game and asked if they had any changes they'd like to make. When Scott Murphy came back with a fairly comprehensive list of things he didn't like, he was told that it was too late to make any of these changes and he'd just have to suck it up because this was a game they're gonna put out, and if he didn't like it, well, that's just too bad.
Hello Ken. Hello, Scott and Mark. You said you had something to show us? Yes. We've been developing a new version of Space Quest 1. A new version of Space Quest 1? Yes. It's in 256 color VGA, and has a brand spanking new point-and-click interface. I don't know about this. Tell you what, you guys go off and play it and let me know if there are any changes you'd like to make. Oh, okay. I've got a bad feeling about this. Hello again. So, what did you think? It's not how I would have done it. To put it another way, it sucks. Really? Yes. We have this list of changes we'd like you to make. I see. Well, we're not going to be able to do that. What? We're too far along in development. Any changes would be too costly and delay the project. But it sucks. I'm afraid you're just going to have to live with it. This sucks too. Good day, gentlemen. Told you I had a bad feeling about this.
And adding insult to injury, they even put his name in the opening credits as director of the game, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with the project, and to this day he's still extremely bitter about the whole thing and fucking hates this game to the very core of his being. And I can honestly see why. I mean, it's not an objectively hideous game or anything, it looks pretty good for an early 90s VGA adventure game, and the music by Ken Allen fucking slaps. But the Space Quest series was always intended to be ahead of its time. The two guys weren't into retro. They wanted their games to be as cutting edge as they could possibly make them. So for this game to adopt this retro 1950s sci-fi style was a design choice that didn't sit right with them, and it kinda went against everything they felt the series stood for. They wanted Space Quest to be this sort of living comic book that was futuristic and modern, not this nostalgic colorized Ted Turner crap. But all that is just surface noise. What really matters is what's under the hood of this thing, and trust me, it's not good. While the CD-ROM version of Space Quest 4 is infamously known for its fucked up timer problems and caused irreparable psychological trauma for DOS gamers in the post-386 era of computing, the Space Quest 1 remake gives it a run for its fucking money. Come to think of it, a lot of Sierra games really struggled with timers. I mean, as far up as Space Quest 6 in 1995, owners of fast PCs still had to contend with shit like the infamous Error 47 bug, or the never-ending scroll into oblivion on the screen with the tapeworm. And the problem here lies with how fast the end user's computers were, specifically in terms of CPU clock speed. See, when you're dealing with time, specifically some sort of countdown, which, let's face it, is what every timer puzzle is, it's something you have to do before some rat bastard countdown reaches 0, you want that countdown to at least be reliable. When someone says you have 30 seconds to do something, those 30 seconds had better be real fucking 30 seconds. Otherwise, well, that's just unfair, isn't it? Now, you can easily do that on a computer. Every frame you see on screen updates at a certain interval. That's what you 3D gamers would like to call frames per second. That frame rate is supposed to be constant, and in the case of 2D point-and-click adventure games, it is. The game's graphics update at a certain reliable interval, which we call ticks. So if you want to have a timer that equates to 1 second, you simply figure out how many times it takes for the game to update a screen before a second has elapsed. In SCI games like the Space Quest 1 remake, a game tick equates to roughly 1/60th of a second, meaning the game will update 60 times per second. Or, at least in theory. Now crucially, these ticks have nothing to do with how fast your computer is. A tick is the same constant interval regardless of whether you're playing on a potato or the fucking Whopper. If it wasn't, and you're playing on a computer that's faster than what the game is expecting, then the game would just look like it's on fast forward and become essentially unplayable. Now here's the fucked up thing. These games do run at a fixed tick rate, yes, but there are actually two factors at play here that influence how fast the game runs. Game ticks, which are supposed to keep the game running at a steady rate of 60 updates per second, and game loops, which run through all the instructions for each time it's supposed to update. And this means stuff like where Roger is, what he's doing, how much shit is going on around him, like background animations, other characters, what the player is doing at any given moment, etc. Ideally, you'd want one game loop per tick. That means everything keeps running nice and smoothly. But back in those days, Sierra were keen to also sell their games to customers running the games on less than ideal specs, and if they kept to a sensible one game loop equals one game tick method, that means the games would perform like ass on computers with CPUs that couldn't keep up, because those CPUs could potentially not complete a whole game loop before the screen had to update. So their solution was to let the game loops run as many times as they wanted. Literally, the game will just run through as many game loops as the CPU can handle, disregarding the tick rate entirely. And while this lets the game update faster on slower machines, it also means that if you run the game on a fast machine, it will literally burn through thousands of game loop updates per second. What this boils down to is that the game is basically fist-fucking your CPU as hard as it can with as many instructions as it can possibly ram into it as fast as it possibly can. And as you can imagine, this leads to some very unpredictable behavior. This means that every time the screen updates, it will have literally thousands of commands to run through, and they all happen at once every second. And while a lot of instructions are told to wait patiently until the game tick has elapsed before moving on to the next, a lot of them aren't. The end result is that some events play out the way they're supposed to, and other events will behave wildly unpredictably. This is how you run into shit like the dreaded Skatorama sequence in Space Quest 4, because the timer that controls when the secret policemen are supposed to show up and shoot your ass isn't tied to the game's tick rate, but instead runs as fast as your CPU will allow. On modern machines, this just turns into absolute chaos. In the Space Quest 1 remake, this shit manifests itself in a variety of ways. While it doesn't produce game-breaking frustrations nearly as aggravating as the Skatorama, it nonetheless does have its fair share of hair-pulling moments. The spider droid is one such infuriating nuisance. Roger's walking speed is tied to the tick rate of the game, as is the spider droid's. But the speed slider in the game settings can and will fuck all of that up, because the speed slider tells the game how many game loops it should run through before updating Roger's sprite. If you leave the speed slider alone, Roger moves how he's supposed to, even on a fast machine. But messing with the speed slider allows the game to run Roger's walking speed through more game loops than the default setting, and that's how Roger's able to zip across the screen like he's the fucking Flash. The spider droid, however, remains unaffected by the speed slider because its movement speed is throttled by the tick rate, meaning the spider droid will only move whenever there's a screen update. So if you run the game on a fast machine and crank the speed slider up to max, Roger's movement speed will increase exponentially, but the spider droids won't. So now you can outrun him because now Roger can just zip across the screen unfettered by the normal laws of physics. So far so good, right? But there's one really infuriating downside to this, and that has to do with the way the spider droid chases you around. Much like the sequel police in Space Quest 4, old Spidey here isn't actually chasing you from one screen to the next. Whenever you change screens, the game doesn't remember where Spidey was on the previous screen, it simply checks what screen he was on previously, then sets a short timer to determine when he's supposed to arrive on the next screen. And that timer is tied to game loops rather than tick speed, which means if your computer's too fast, this fucker will just straight up teleport right up your ass when you switch screens instead of waiting around for a bit like a good little boy. But not only that, the designers of this remake also threw in an extra couple of fuck yous that weren't in the original. While you're getting chased around by the spider droid, there's a chance Roger may randomly trip over his goddamn feet, which is almost always a surefire death sentence because his falling over animation bypasses the game loop instructions set by the speed slider and is instead tied to a specific number of game ticks. And for whatever reason, this animation speed is really slow, so even if you've got the game running at full pelt on a souped up supercomputer, Roger seems to fall almost in slow motion. And this gives the spider droid more than enough time to catch up to you and explode on contact. In fact, sometimes it'll even get you before you hit the ground. This also seems to be a fairly random occurrence too, so there's no way of safeguarding yourself against it. You just have to keep a save game handy and restore in case Roger fumbles his step and faceplants into the ground. You also have to pick up the sticky plant from the surface, which you're meant to use when you get to the next section in the underground caverns, because this is one of those few instances where the remake differs from the original game. Instead of just sneaking past this great monster by just hugging the wall as you do in the original version, you're meant to chuck the sticky plant at it. The animation that plays when you pick up the plant is also independent of how fast the speed slider is set. And it's a really long animation that, much like Roger falling over, plays out agonizingly slowly. It's also a blocking animation, meaning that you have no control over Roger while the animation is playing. And this would be fine if it wasn't for the fact that everything else in the game world keeps merrily jogging away instead of waiting around for the animation to finish, which means if the spider droid is around, he has all the time in the world to catch up to you while you're fucking around with this plant and explode on your ass. Granted, you can hold off on actually getting this plant until you're safe. You can either dispatch the spider droid by dropping this piece of jutted ribcage on top of it, or simply pick up the plant before he shows up. But actually, no, that last bit isn't really an option because, again, if your CPU speed is too fast, the timer that controls when this little bastard drops out of the sky is, you guessed it, controlled by game loops instead of tick rates. None of that will matter too much though, because you'll most likely die of thirst before any of this happens. When you're on the surface, Roger gets more and more thirsty while traversing under the baking hot sun until he eventually keels over and dies of dehydration. You get 2 warnings before that happens though, and when you get the warning, you're meant to chuck this water bottle you found in the escape pod survival kit, which resets the timer. Doing so while the spider droid is chasing you is an instant death sentence because this is once again one of those glacially slow animations that are tied to tick speed. But even if you've managed to ascend to the safe zone up on the skeletal ridge, it doesn't really matter because the thirsty timer itself is not tied to the tick rate, which means you'll be chugging from this water bottle every few seconds until you can safely make it to the secret elevator. That's assuming you catch a very lucky break though, because if your CPU happens to be on the very fast side, the 2 warnings and the message saying you've now died of thirst happen so closely back to back that you won't even have time to fish out the water bottle from your inventory and click it on Roger before you're already dead. Things don't exactly improve once you make your way to the next section underground because these acid drops turn into a goddamn waterfall on fast CPU speeds, and you just have to YOLO your way through them with one eye closed and hope you somehow catch a lucky break and make it across. There is a pretty funny side effect to this though, because if you get hit by one of these acid drops, Roger has to perform this little melting animation before the game flags him as dead and the death screen pops up. The game does this by changing Roger's walking animation to the melting animation, and while the game does block player input while the melting animation plays, which should stop Roger dead in his tracks, there's a brief delay between when the game starts playing the animation and the blocking occurs. If you manage to hit a screen exit hotspot before the game has a chance to block, the screen exit overrides the blocking and allows Roger to change screens. And since the game doesn't keep track of what happens on previous screens, this not only means you will escape your death sentence, it also means that every time you try to walk somewhere, Roger will just keep melting into the ground over and over again. In fact, some of these timer bugs aren't detrimental to the player and can actually come in rather handy. The skimmer sequence where you have to dodge these oncoming rocks can be a pain in the ass on normal speed, but as previously mentioned, cranking the game speed makes Roger move inhumanly fast, and the skimmer is actually just Roger's walking animation with the graphics changed to him sitting in the skimmer. The oncoming rocks, however, are tied to tick speed, so if you bump the speed up to maximum on a fast computer, Roger can more or less teleport in an instant across the screen, avoiding the slow rocks and making the sequence almost trivial. The same exploit also applies to the Sarian guards at the start of the game, because even though the timer that controls their arrival is affected by game loops hammering away at uncontrolled speeds in the background, Roger's inhuman walking speed allows him to take cover almost instantly after getting the "you hear footsteps" warning, which makes the timer almost ludicrously forgiving. There are numerous other glitches in the game pertaining to speed, but these were the most interesting ones I could think of. Let me know in the comments if I missed something. But hey, I should probably mention this glitch that Epic Potato Fiend found when he was playing the Amiga version while streaming on my Discord. Somehow he managed to glitch out the great monster in the cave, and Roger ended up right on top of him, stuck forever in his throwing animation, which just looks like he's beating the shit out of the monster with his bare hands. We couldn't get this to work in the PC version, and I'm not even sure how Epic Potato managed to trigger this in the Amiga version, but luckily I was recording his stream at the time, so we managed to get footage of it. Enjoy. On the whole, Sierra's point-and-click games from the early to mid-90s fascinate me because in many ways they are so hilariously broken on so many levels. I focused on the Space Quest 1 remake in this video, but it's by no means the only example of just how fucked up things can get. Space Quest 4 CD is obviously about as fucked up as you can get, but games like Lorabo 2, The Dagger of Amun-Ra, and Quest for Glory 4 are also famously and infamously bugged up the ass. The common denominator between these games is that they run on either the SCI-1 or SCI-32 engines, which were the successors to Sierra's first SCI engine, which we now call SCI-0. The first iteration of the SCI engine ran games like Police Quest 2, Space Quest 3, and the first Lorabo game, Colonel's Bequest, and it is on the whole a sturdily constructed engine that very rarely cracks under pressure. But things started to go absolutely pear-shaped once Sierra became concerned that their games were too advanced to run on potato hardware, and all the games Sierra released since then have so many quirks and exploits and game-breaking glitches, it is honestly amazing they even run in the first place. In fact, this whole mess with the timers and unthrottled game loops also explains the infamous Error 47 not an object crash in Space Quest 6 and Quest for Glory 4. It's actually a timer bug, and the reason it happens is because the game is trying to play a special animation. In the case of Space Quest 6, it's the animation of Roger inserting the data cartridge into the compost, but the timer that's set to allow the animation to complete runs out before the screen changes, and when the screen changes, the game is still waiting to complete the animation, but once again, since the game doesn't keep track of what happens on previous screens, that animation technically doesn't exist on the new screen. So the game is trying to play an animation that doesn't exist on the new screen you just arrived at, and this bombs the game to DOS with the error message, not an object. The object in this case referring to the special animation that was supposed to play on the previous screen. Well, this was fun, wasn't it? I have to give a special shout out to Sluicebox, who provided me with a comprehensive overview of how these games work under the hood. All of these timer glitches I've mentioned in this video only pertain to when you're running the games on original hardware or in DOSBox. If you run them in ScumVM, these glitches have been fixed courtesy of Sluicebox and the other stalwart developers of ScumVM. And indeed, we owe a massive thanks to the developers of platforms like ScumVM and DOSBox that make it possible for us to even play these games today. These people have done and continue to do a tremendous service to the retro DOS gaming community and to help preserve these games for future generations. There's still a vast swath of games developed in the late 90s and early 2000s, an era I like to refer to as the dark ages of computer gaming, that are impossible to run on modern hardware unless you know how to set up a virtual machine, and even then it's still a massive uphill battle. So kudos to the DOS gaming community and the people who keep these games alive, not just in our hearts and memories, but also so that we can continue to enjoy them despite the decades of advancements that have been made since their releases. And as far as Sierra goes, they were determined to be at the forefront of the rapidly developing technological landscape at the time, but in their efforts to make sure that they could sell their games to as many people as possible, they made one too many concessions with regards to how their games worked under the hood, and this ended up absolutely biting their ass in the long run. I mean, it makes sense from a business standpoint, but unfortunately they ended up traumatizing a whole generation of PC gamers who to this day curse the Spider Droid and the Skaterama right to fucking hell. I'm the Space Quest Historian, and until next time, remember that hindsight is 20/20, but the Spider Droid can still go fuck itself, and I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Bye!